Daniel sat in the quiet corner of a small café, watching the rain streak down the window. Across from him, Emily stirred her coffee, her gaze drifting outside. Suddenly, her hand froze mid-stir, her eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He looks like your dead son." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He turned his head slowly, his heart thudding in his chest. Outside, beneath the dripping awning, stood a young man no older than 20. His clothes were worn, his shoulders hunched against the cold. But it wasn't just his shivering frame that caught Daniel's breath, it was the face. The same untamed hair. The same deep, searching eyes. Even the way he shifted nervously from foot to foot felt painfully familiar. For a moment, Daniel wasn't in the cafe anymore. He was back in the baseball stands, cheering for his boy. He was standing in the doorway the night Ethan came home late, grinning and apologizing all at once. And then he was at the hospital, staring at a still body that would never laugh again. Now, here was this stranger, so achingly similar it hurt to look. Daniel's coffee sat untouched as the rain kept falling. Emily's hand slid over his, urging him gently. He knew he had to move, had to step outside. Something deep inside told him this wasn't just coincidence. Maybe, just maybe, life was giving him a second chance to save someone else's son. Daniel couldn't tear his eyes away from the boy outside. Every detail pulled him deeper into the ache of memory, the slight slouch in his shoulders, the restless shifting of his weight, the way he kept glancing around as if unsure he belonged anywhere. It was uncanny. It was Ethan. 3 years had passed since the accident, yet the pain was as raw as the day it happened. Daniel remembered the last time he'd seen his son alive, Ethan standing in the doorway, hair messy, eyes full of mischief, promising he'd be home in an hour. That promise was broken forever when a phone call shattered Daniel's world later that night. Now, watching the boy under the awning, Daniel noticed something that made his breath catch, the faint scar just above the eyebrow, identical to Ethan's, from when he'd fallen off his bike at 9. It was too much. His hands trembled, and his chest tightened. He didn't believe in ghosts, yet this felt impossibly close. Emily leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. "Go talk to him, Daniel." The rain outside blurred the view, but nothing could wash away the strange pull he felt toward this stranger. He swallowed hard, knowing that stepping outside wasn't just about curiosity, it was about facing the jagged edge of his grief. Somewhere in his gut, a small voice whispered that this meeting might change more than just the rest of his day. It could change the rest of his life. Daniel pushed open the cafe door, the chill of the rain immediately seeping into his skin. The boy noticed him and stiffened, as if preparing to run. Up close, Daniel could see the weariness etched into his young face, the hollow cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his damp hair clung to his forehead. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked softly, careful not to startle him. The boy's gaze darted toward the street, then back to Daniel. For a moment, he didn't answer, his lips pressed into a tight line. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I haven't eaten in 2 days." His voice cracked, and Daniel felt something deep inside him fracture. The rain drummed steadily around them, but Daniel barely noticed. This wasn't just a hungry stranger, this was someone's son, standing alone in the cold. He thought of how Ethan would have sounded if life had been crueler, if there had been no home to return to, no father to care. Without hesitation, Daniel said, "Come inside. Let me get you something warm." The boy hesitated, suspicion flickering in his eyes, but hunger eventually won. Together, they stepped back into the cafe. Daniel ordered soup and a sandwich, watching as the boy devoured the food. Between bites, he finally said his name, Sam. Daniel didn't know why, but the sound of it stirred something in him. This meeting no longer felt like chance. It felt like the beginning of something he wasn't yet ready to name. As Sam finished the last bite of his sandwich, he mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," and began to stand, clearly preparing to leave. Something in Daniel panicked at the thought of him walking back into the cold, back to whatever loneliness had carved those lines into his young face. You remind me of my son," Daniel blurted out before he could stop himself. Sam froze, his hand still on the back of the chair. His eyes flickered with confusion, then softened, as if he sensed the weight behind the words. Daniel leaned forward, his voice thick. "I lost him a few years ago. He was about your age." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The man carrying the burden of loss, the boy carrying the burden of survival. Sam finally lowered himself back into the chair. He spoke in halting sentences, telling Daniel about his mother's death, the relatives who wouldn't take him in, the nights spent sleeping in bus stations and under bridges. Daniel listened, every word carving deeper into his heart. When Sam's story trailed off, he looked down, bracing for pity. But instead, Daniel said quietly, "Come home with us. Just for tonight. You shouldn't be out there." Sam's head snapped up, disbelief in his eyes. Daniel didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that in this moment, he couldn't turn away. This was no longer about chance, it was about choice. And he chose not to lose another son. Weeks slipped by, and, just for tonight, quietly became something permanent. Sam's place at the dinner table was no longer a guest seat, it was his seat. The once guarded boy began to laugh more, speak more, even leave his shoes by the door like he belonged there. Daniel found himself looking forward to their evenings together, helping Sam with homework or listening to him talk about dreams he'd never dared to share before. One rainy evening, Daniel was in the living room, leaning over the coffee table, explaining a math problem while Sam scribbled notes. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes soft with quiet emotion. When Sam looked up and smiled, a real smile, full of warmth, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The emptiness that had lived in his chest for years didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. Emily crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Maybe we can't choose who we lose," she whispered, her voice thick with meaning, "but we can choose who we save." Daniel nodded slowly, his throat too tight for words. He glanced at Sam, who was now bent over his paper again, humming softly under his breath. In that moment, Daniel understood, he hadn't been given his son back, but he had been given the chance to be a father again. And sometimes, that was enough to turn grief into something life-giving, something that could change two lives at once.